Hi class, this is Adam Borsay for our second video response to the reading for this class. So this week we're looking at comparing, contrasting existential theory and the Gestalt theory in counseling with a focus on how they compare, how they contrast, strengths, weaknesses, and for our purposes, the way they can either conflict or even be very integrated with a Christian worldview. And so just kind of a quick 40,000 foot overview. Existential therapy is an approach that is very broad in the sense that it's looking at big themes in life, looking at mortality, looking at death and your whole life, and trying to integrate that for a person, dealing with the whole aspect of life. Gestalt is more of just helping someone, or an approach that's a focus on the here and now. Just that idea of what is present in the moment, not because the future isn't here yet. The past is behind us, and it practically doesn't exist for our purposes. And so, in general, I think that's as we start, those are kind of those big differences between the two. While obviously there's a lot of intersection, just the fact that Gestalt is so focused on the right now, which because you would see in existential the idea of even thinking about the concept of death, and then from the humanist perspective as an existential theory, it'd be that nothingness that comes with death, and having that shape how you live now, while Gestalt approach would really not have anything to do with what may or may not be happening to you in 30 or 40 years. That doesn't matter. You have to figure out how to focus and deal with your energies in the now. And so that's a big contrast. Some of the similarities that I saw in the reading that I thought were they're pretty common, I would say, in a lot of the theories, but were pronounced between Gestalt and existential, would just be a lot to do with their focus on acceptance of what's going on. Like existential had a lot to do with just acceptance of anxiety, and just, hey, this is life and you just have to accept it. Gestalt is just has a lot to do about accepting the reality of your life right now and all that might entail, and how being overly concerned about things that you can't control because they're in the future or they're from the past is not helpful in the now. And so while they have a different approach or reason as to why they would say acceptance is a key factor, I think there is a really interesting connection in that kind of stuff. Just that real ownership for both of them in just accepting who you are and being okay and understanding who you are, taking ownership of yourself as an individual. That seems to be a very common theme connecting those two theories as in our counseling class that we're reading about. I would say there are obviously in most of these things you would see most of these theories you see a interesting connection between a Christian worldview and some of the things that these theorists would bring to the whole philosophy that they're promoting, they're teaching. Specifically with existential, some of the similarities that I thought were important is, well, just the idea that you have to take you have to accept where you are in life, accept the circumstance. Very biblical concept, like everyone from Job to Paul talked a lot about this idea of I am who I am and this is my life, and I can argue with God, but that doesn't change anything. And so I think you see a big comparison there. Gestalt had some very similar connections to Christianity. Just this idea of they put a big emphasis in Gestalt theory on the importance of building that support system, acceptance within that support system, having empathy and respect and dialogue, even if it requires confrontation with people. And we see that in Scripture as well, just the idea of community. Iron sharpens iron, and Paul telling us that all Scriptures in 2 Timothy all Scripture is good for training others, training up in righteousness to call people to account to the truth. And so that's a very Gestalt kind of idea, that to be able to have those dialogues that are speaking truth to people. Some of the contrasts I think would be troubling for me as a Christian, as if I would dive into either one of these theories. As one, and I thought this was huge, I already mentioned anxiety being a big part of the existential theory and just that acceptance of it. Is biblically, we're told that anxiety is not something that we should accept. The Scripture doesn't put it in that exact term, but that we should not be anxious about anything, but that instead live in peace, and that instead in prayer go to God. That anxiety is not God's desire for us to just be walking around with any type of anxiety. While existential theorists, which kind of say, "Oh, anxiety, just deal with it. That's life," and I'm obviously putting very overly simplistically, but I thought that was something that I would struggle with. But also, their emphasis on the here and now is all that matters. You only live once. It seems like that's a theory of life that has had a lot of dominance in the last couple decades. And obviously, as Christians, we know that while this life has value that we can barely even begin to measure in this mortal experience, but that's not all there is. And some of the beauty of this life is the perspective of that we're made for eternity. And so that existential concept of find joy in the right now because that's all you have seems really, for me, anti-Christian to a degree. Gestalt, its biggest contrast, I felt, is this emphasis on that nothing but the now is what matters. And while there is truth to that as a Christian, that I'm not defined by my past, this idea just don't worry about the future, don't worry about the past, just focus in right now on the now. And while there is a truth to that as a Christian, we are a holistic people. That we have the thumbprint of eternity in our lives. We worship a God who existed from eternity past to eternity future. All aspects of time matters to God, and they're part of our story. And so I didn't feel like that really connected well with me as from a Christian perspective. When I think about some of the limitations, if I was going to be working with a client to creating measurable outcomes for a client in either of these theories, I felt the challenges could be, from my perspective, is existential just felt really ambiguous, like a lot of feeling kind of approaches, like how do I feel and how am I going to actualize my feelings, those kinds of approaches. For me, I perceive things a lot more kind of structured. And so I would say, how do I create a measured outcome that your subjective sense of well-being or managing your anxiety better? To me, that'd be hard to kind of figure out. How do we set a plan? How do we evaluate how we're doing on the plan? Are we getting closer to the plan when it seems so subjective? And for Gestalt, the limitations, I felt if you were putting together a care plan with some goals for a client, I felt like it was something a little easier I could try to think through and manage. But I felt like some of the goals of how do you measure how well someone is managing their energies and redirecting their energies now? Again, that seems like a really esoteric concept. Like if that's one of the therapeutic goals, to say, what are these blockages in your energy that you need to apply to different things? I would struggle thinking through, and I'm sure if someone dove a lot deeper into the subject matter, they'd have some more clarity. But from my viewpoint, dipping my toes into the theory, I felt like that would be a limitation for me. Well, I'm enjoying the class. Thanks everyone for your contributions, and I look forward to seeing other people's videos.